Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. Foreclosure is a specific legal process in which a lender attempts to recover the balance of a loan from a borrower who has stopped making payments to the lender by forcing the sale of the asset used as collateral for the loan. The process of gaining control of that property by the lender is organized by the court system. In some political subdivisions, mediation is offered between the bank and the borrower before the foreclosure process proceeds. The St. Louis County Council is considering such a law. Councilwoman Hazel Erby has introduced a bill which would establish a mediation program which would be paid for by requiring to pay $150 to St. Louis County when the lender begins the foreclosure process. The lender would be required to pay an additional $350 if the borrower chooses mediation. Todd Swanstrom, a professor in community collaboration and public policy at UMSL, co-authored an op-ed in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on this subject. Professor Swanstrom is here today to talk to us about his article and the merits of the foreclosure mediation. Todd Swanstrom, welcome to Conversation.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
I have to say that I just sort of called you out of the blue, and I'm glad that you decided to come and talk to us about this op-ed.
Well, I'm eager to talk about it because it's a significant issue. You know, when I started studying foreclosures 4 years ago, I figured, well, I'm probably too late. By the time I get this research done in a year or two, the whole crisis will be over with and my research will be passé. But it turns out 4 years later, it's still going strong. It's still as serious an issue as ever.
What was the state of foreclosures in the United States when you started your research, and what is it? Where are we now?
Well, when I started in 2008, 2009, when the crisis was just beginning, really foreclosures were being driven by what are called subprime loans or sometimes predatory loans. These are loans that were marketed aggressively to people, and in many cases, you had borrowers getting into loans that they really shouldn't have been in. They didn't know what they were getting into. These were often abusive terms. For example, a large prepayment penalty. I don't know about you, Lee, but if I would get a mortgage and I want to pay it off early, they shouldn't penalize me for that. But some of these instruments had that in it. They also had, sometimes they had teaser rates that started low and then jumped you up to a much higher interest rate. So in 2008, a lot of people, in 2009, people were being caught who had been caught in these predatory and subprime loans. But as we know now, what's happened is that this whole foreclosure subprime crisis is what brought down the entire economy. Because Wall Street packaged these things and then leveraged them up into all these investment vehicles. And when these mortgages went bad and people couldn't pay them, investors all over the world had to take a bath, and it sucked billions of dollars out of the American economy and put us into a recession. So what's happening now is a lot of people are going through foreclosures, not because they have a bad loan. There's still some of that out there, but not much. But largely because they lost their job or they've had a divorce or an illness and they're not able to make the payments. Now, previously, in earlier periods, if you were facing a foreclosure, usually you just sold your home and paid off the bank, right? And went on with your life. But if the values have gone down, which we know they have here in the St. Louis area, you can't just sell the home and pay off the loan. So now we have a second wave of foreclosures caused by the economic crisis.
Now, there was a pause in the foreclosure process for about a year or so due to a problem which I'll bet you'd like to describe, which had to do with people signing documents that were missing from the file.
Well, this is the so-called Robosigning Scandal, where these mortgage firms would hire people to notarize the legal documents for a foreclosure. And you had individuals who sometimes, frankly, didn't even have a high school degree, right? Didn't really have the qualifications, who were signing thousands of documents, tens of thousands of documents each month. And they were supposed to be verifying the legal validity of these documents and notarizing them, but in fact, they didn't know what they were doing. So what that did is it cast a shadow over the whole foreclosure process. So for a while there, a lot of foreclosures were held up. So we had sort of a backlog of impending foreclosures, and now we're seeing them kind of roll out as the legal the legal problems have begun to be worked out, although there's still some serious problems with the foreclosure process.
Interestingly, I did my own research on this very topic that you're talking about, and so I'm just going to briefly say to you, and therefore to the audience, what it was that I found out. During the course of buying a house, you sign two pieces of paper. One is the note, and the other is the deed of trust. And that normally, in the old days, both of these papers were tucked into a file folder and then put in a box and then put in the basement of the bank or a vault or somewhere where they were just held. And at the time when you paid off your loan, then these papers were, taken out, stamped that it's paid, and probably given back to the people that signed them in the first place. But as you were saying, that many of these loans were repackaged, and so the note and the deed of trust got separated, and one of these pieces of paper stayed and the other one left, and that's what you're talking, because these pieces of paper went to the bank that bought that bank, and then it went to the bank that bought that series, and then eventually, from what I understand, literally these papers, they weren't smart enough, these people who were way up at the top, to know that this piece of paper was important. And so they lost track of those pieces of paper. And as a result, some lawyer somewhere, and I forget who he was, went in a foreclosure case and said to the judge, "Judge, don't these folks need to show this original piece of paper with the original signature on it before they can foreclose?" And the judge says, "Well, you're right."
Right.
And that was the beginning of where all of a sudden these bank guys, who were too dumb to know that they needed to have both pieces of paper in the same place in order to recover their property, suddenly started creating all of these pieces of paper so that they can go into court and recover their pieces of property.
Right. Well, this is Pandora's box, Lee, that the judicial system is reluctant to actually open up, because if, in fact, these irregularities were ever completely enforced, the whole system could come to a halt. So judges around the country, while acknowledging this problem, have been reluctant to actually totally put a stop to foreclosure procedures.
Now, reality is, somebody went and said to somebody, "Look, I want to buy this house. I need you to loan me some money, but I'll pay you back." And in good faith, both of these parties said, "Okay, fine, I'll loan you the money, but you got to promise to pay this thing back." And then the folks who had promised to pay back weren't, for whatever reasons.
Right.
And the guys that put their money out in order to make this purchase of the house, they just want their money back.
Well, it would seem like it's a straightforward issue that way, but because of the way individual mortgages have been packaged into these mortgage-backed securities, which are pools of mortgages, and then these in turn have been sold to investors, and then other investors have bought credit default swaps and other things to guarantee these mortgages, it's become further and further separated from the original transaction, further and further from the house in Illinois, which was originally purchased. So, after World War II, up until the 90s, we had a system in the United States of pretty much standard 30-year loans, FHA, VA, standardized, 10 or 20% down, and the bank would would sell that.
Mr. Smith, who sat at the bank for all those years, you go up and see Mr. Smith.
Exactly.
He knew you, you knew him, you shook hands, then you signed papers, and Mr. Smith paid whoever the old owner was, and then you were the new owner.
Right. It was a very straightforward system, and there was some trust, and there was some relationships there that smooth the system. What we have now is the people who service these loans are separate from the people who own the loans often. So there are servicing companies. These servicing companies grew up, and essentially they were just check processors, right? They turn out, all they did is collect your check and deposit in an account. And they're extremely efficient, low wage, high volume, pretty profitable. Now, when they get to a situation where they have an additional responsibility called, in circumstance where somebody is facing a foreclosure, would it make more sense for us to lengthen the term of the loan, perhaps reduce the loan somewhat, whatever we can do to prevent a foreclosure? When can we modify these loans, right? Because it turns out that from the viewpoint of the lender, it often does not make sense to go into foreclosure. You take a bath. Often the research would show up to 50% of your investment is down the drain when you go through a foreclosure. Lawyers' fees, you got real estate fees, you got transaction fees, and also the value of the home that you're repossessing goes down. In the research I did in St. Louis County, on average, a foreclosed property loses 28% of its value, identical to any other home. It's already 28% less because of the foreclosure.
And,
so
and
you're taking a
identical
bath.
homes have already gone down in value as well.
Yeah, that's
in
right,
St. Louis
because of
County.
the whole real estate market and the foreclosure. So what we have is a situation where you have these servicing companies who they might be located in North Dakota or India, right? The person you call on the phone to try to deal with this, what do they know about real estate in Madison County, right? And so it's very hard for them to really work in the system and do what's often in the best interest of the lenders. So this mediation legislation that you mentioned at the beginning of the program, in part, that's designed to get the lender to be in a position where, if it's in the interest of the lender, to modify the loan and prevent the foreclosure, which benefits the lender and it benefits the homeowner. But it's very difficult to get that done now when you've got these servicers who don't know what they're doing, who lose paperwork, you can't get them on the phone. The horror stories are just legions about the problems with these servicers.
Okay. Now, in one of the articles that was in the Post-Dispatch, not yours, trying to remember if, here it is, these things
I
necessary. Yes. Most homeowners who reject mediation may have a good reason. They know they can't be saved. A homeowner with no job is going to lose the house. The close calls involve the homeowners with paychecks big enough to make a house payment, just not the payment set in their mortgage. The bank then decides if it would lose less money by foreclosing them than taking what the homeowner can pay.
Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, that's very important, because in most cases, if you don't have a job, you're not going to save your home, right? Just maybe a short sale, maybe you've got to go through foreclosure and go on with your life, and that's too bad. You'll be forced out of your home and your family will be forced to move. But there are many cases, a minority I would suggest, but there's many, where there is a possibility for a win-win solution. That is, the lender can do better and the homeowner can do better if we can modify this loan and come up with an agreement.
Now,
and
these people that you're talking about, the ones who might be in the position to save themselves, are they not capable of knowing that if just make a phone call and try and negotiate?
Lee, you've got to talk to people out there and their experiences with the servicing companies.
Tell us what
happens is you pick up the phone, you got an 800 number, you wait on the line. When you finally get a hold of somebody, they don't have responsibility to alter the loan, they don't have the power to alter the loan. They request certain documentation, and you send them the documentation, they lose the documentation. I'm not saying this is true in all cases. There are just many, many cases of servicer problems. And the purpose of the mediation, what the mediation says, is that the lender, if the homeowner requests mediation, the lender must provide the documentation and must have somebody either in person or on a conference call who has authority to modify the loan if such an agreement is come to. So, too many cases, in other cases, individuals are left out there. In fact, for most people, Lee, they talk to no one before the foreclosure. Foreclosure is viewed as shameful, as they feel like it's their fault. They don't get on the phone and try to do something about it often. There are foreclosure counselors in the region who work with people and try to get them the best deal. And obviously in some cases it is the fault of the individual, right? They probably shouldn't have gotten in over their head in that loan. But for many people, they just bought the house at the wrong time and values have gone down. They'd like to sell the house and move on to another job, but they can't because the house is worth less, or they've lost their job or whatever. So it's a difficult situation, but we can do much better in keeping people in their homes. And the point I would make about this too, Lee, right so far we've been talking about it as if what we're doing is in the best interest of the lender and the homeowner, but there's also Joe Q. citizen out there to worry about. In other words, foreclosures have a negative impact on surrounding properties. So the taxpayers of this region should be concerned about the impact of foreclosures even if they are not in a foreclosure. The research shows, for example, that every property within about 1/8 of a mile, which is 660 feet of a foreclosure, loses value because of the foreclosure. On average, about 1–2%. But if you start adding those up, thousands of foreclosures, what you get, and I did an article a while back in St. Louis County, the title of it was St. Louis County's $1 billion problem. It's that foreclosures in St. Louis County have caused a drop in property values of about $1 billion. So somebody has lost $1 billion, and most of that is people who have not gone through a foreclosure. So we ought to be doing something about this, not just in the interest of the lender and the homeowner, but also in the interest of society.
Has the county, and I'm talking about St. Louis County, not Madison County, has St. Louis County taken it upon themselves, like for example, Mr. Zimmerman's office, to send, because they get a paper from the bank, don't they, an intent? I forget what it's called, but it's basically a letter of intent that says to the to local officials, hey, we intend to take this back because they're not paying us. You would think
the foreclosure notice in the paper, yeah.
You would think that the county would then be sending something like what you're talking about to these homeowners and say, hey, do you know you have rights and you might want to try to negotiate, or
exactly.
something like that.
Exactly. Well, once again, if this mediation program were passed, and I think it's going to come up for a vote next week,
by the way,
then there would be such a notice.
Just so people know, we're having this conversation on August 28th, 2012. Who knows when people see this what will have happened? So,
sure,
having said that, so go ahead. What do you
think?
So
if this legislation passes, there will be a notice to homeowners that they have a right to mediation. And the opponents of mediation characterize this as mandatory mediation. It's really not mandatory mediation. From the viewpoint of the homeowner, it's only if they choose to do so. And from our experience across the nation, this has been done in about 20 to 25 states across the nation, some form of mediation. Only about 20% will opt for mediation. The rest of them know they just don't have the resources or whatever to avoid the foreclosure. So those 20% will know that the right to mediation, and what that means is they have a right to appear in a process. They have to provide their own documentation of their income and all the other requirements, and the lender has to provide the documentation as well, and there's a neutral mediator who tries to see if there's a solution that will benefit both parties, and only if both parties agree to it will there be a loan modification or whatever result comes out of it. In other words, no one is forced to do, there's nothing, no property owner is forced to do anything with their property that they don't agree to. It's totally voluntary from that point of view. But at least in this case, yeah, it would give people an option they don't presently have. There is free foreclosure counseling across the region, sponsored by NeighborWorks, and you have an option to opt for that, which is you get the right to a counselor there, and those counselors have spent years making those phone calls, and they usually have contacts at the banks and contacts with the servicers where they can do a lot better than any individual homeowner. You don't, as an individual homeowner, want to try to solve this problem on your own. I think you'll find that it's a big bureaucracy up there that you're trying to deal with, and it's very difficult to get them to be more flexible.
Sounds like you're talking almost like credit counseling, where people who can't pay their credit cards are told, well, if you go to credit counseling, they'll negotiate out a deal for you, but you're then put in a straitjacket. This is how you have to behave. This is what you have to pay.
That's right. I mean, the foreclosure counseling turns out it does succeed in many instances. This is even before mediation, right? This is the research on this, probably one of the best pieces of social science research on this topic, where they compared hundreds of thousands of homeowners who entered foreclosure counseling with hundreds of thousands of homeowners who did not enter counseling. And what they found out is that I think those who entered foreclosure were 60% more likely to stay in their home, to cure the foreclosure, to avoid a foreclosure. So these counselors know what they're doing, and I wish more people would avail themselves of them. But the other thing is, they're all swamped with work. They've got files like this on their desk, and these cases just drag on and drag on. So it's a very arduous process. And somehow we've got to get these servicers to be much more flexible and much more proactive. The Obama administration has a program which is designed to keep people in their homes so that no one would pay more than about 31% of their income on their mortgage. If they have income and they can make that payment, then the government provides incentives to the servicers to do this. Frankly, the program has been a disappointment. It's resulted in about 800,000 foreclosure modifications, but they were hoping to do millions, many million. And the carrots have not been enough.
Well, just so the audience is aware, as we're sitting here today in the latter part of just before Labor Day in 2012, 1.2 million homeowners are 30 days past due. 1.2 are on the 60-day list, and another 2 or just over 2 are 90 days or more.
Right.
So we're talking somewhere 4 to 5 million people, or homeowners I should say,
Right.
or homes, are right now on the chopping block. These
Right.
are places where unless they can find a way to either reschedule or pay what they owe,
Right.
they're out.
Well,
That's 5 million more houses.
That's right. And you know what this is? This is a wrenching experience. When families are involuntarily moved out of their home, then you pull the kids out of school. When you pull the kids out of school, every time a kid is pulled out of school, it's the equivalent, according to one research recently, of keeping that child out of school for a month. And then they get back into school, right, and they're a month behind. I don't know about you, but if my daughters were not in school for a month, I would be pulling my hair out, right? Because I know you fall behind and you're never going to catch up. So each of these foreclosures, there's been, if this whole thing plays out the way it may play out, there will be over 10 million families displaced by foreclosures in the United States from the crisis. And that 10 million families means probably close to 30 million people who have been wrenched out of their home, and that often means severing the social networks, severing all the relationships they had in that community. So it's a very wrenching experience. In fact, research has shown it's related to crime, that areas that have high foreclosure rates have higher crime rates, other things being equal. So this is a serious problem, and I feel like, Lee, I often feel like I'm watching a slow motion train wreck, and there's nothing I can do about it, right? They're just coming at each other, and you see these people being damaged by this collision, and it seems like we ought to be doing a lot more. Federal government, state government, local governments ought to be doing a lot more.
Yes, but I also want to talk about individual responsibility. You've already indicated there's a lot of people that got themselves into loans that they didn't understand. They signed a contract without understanding the terms of the contract. Unless they were being hoodwinked,
Right.
this is on them too. They themselves have caused this problem to occur.
Yes. You're right. I mean, my attitude for the most part, now, this is a serious problem. It's called the moral hazard problem, by the way, in public policy circles. The moral hazard is that if you help people who got themselves into trouble, you're just encouraging them to get into more trouble in the future, right? But here's the other analogy is if you're a firefighter and you come to a home, you don't first ask the homeowner if he was smoking in bed. You put out the fire. So my attitude, let's do something about this foreclosure crisis. Let's get it solved. Let's keep people in their communities, and then we can address these other issues. If individual responsibility was the main cause of the foreclosure crisis, why was there a sudden eruption of irresponsibility starting in the early 2000s, right? The answer to that is it wasn't so much individual responsibility. It was mortgage lenders inventing new and largely deceptive products that got people into loans they shouldn't have been in. People should have exercised more due diligence. I'll give you that.
Right.
But I don't know. I've refinanced my home several times, and every time I go in, I have a stack of papers about this high. My wife and I sign, and I don't read every line of that. If somebody were to put something in there, I'm just lucky I have a.
And you're a professor who reads professionally.
Exactly. So you can't expect the average consumer to be aware of every little dotted I and crossed T in a mortgage instrument, and some of those were simply deceptive. So once again, I don't want to say that people are not, in many cases, responsible. Some used their home as an ATM and went off on a consumption spree. But for the most part, it was driven, as I said, initially by these deceptive predatory loans, and then later by the dip in the economy and the dip in the real estate market, which has left a lot of people underwater, which is to say owing more in their home than their mortgage is worth, than their house is worth.
We got about 4 minutes, believe it or not, left here.
Sure.
It goes by quick.
Yeah.
Normally I say, was there anything we haven't covered? But I'm sure we've covered most of what it is you have to say. So in this last 4 minutes, I'm going to throw it open to you to talk about whatever areas we haven't covered or anything that you want to put out there.
Well, thank you, Lee. As part of my professorship at the University of Missouri St. Louis, what I've done is I've dedicated myself and the resources of my endowment to community development in this region. What that means is working with neighborhoods and communities to try to they can lift themselves up. This is the work that is, what we say is it has to meet the double bottom line. It's got to meet the bottom line of the marketplace, right? In other words, if you build housing, you've got to be able to sell it or rent it. But also it has a social mission, which is to say deal with families and communities that are experiencing problems. And there's a lot of good groups out there in the region who are working in very, very disadvantaged situations trying to turn these neighborhoods around.
Jim Roos, you know him?
I've heard the name.
Yes, he's one of these guys that,
Right.
that turns houses and tries to put people who really can't afford to, but tries to get them as homeowners.
Yes. Well, you know, what's needed, what we have in the St. Louis metropolitan area, we have the continued out-movement of middle-class families to the suburban fringe, leaving behind communities toward the center where the middle class is missing. And if you don't have a strong middle class, you're not going to have a strong neighborhood. You need a mix of incomes. You can't have a neighborhood where the poverty rate is 30, 40, and 50%. So we have these neighborhoods where the poverty rate is above 30 or 40%, and that's very, very difficult. So we've got to learn how to construct balanced communities. Some of these communities, by the way, have great strengths. I mean, they have walkable retail, they have parks, they have urban amenities that can make them attractive. So I think we need to do a lot more to invest in these communities and to empower the people in these neighborhoods to kind of lift themselves up by their own bootstraps, which is more than housing. It can't just be housing. If you just build a house in a market that's very weak, you might just move somebody 6 blocks down into a new house and then you've got a vacant house down the block. You've got to do jobs, you've got to look at the schools, you've got to look at public spaces, you've got to look at the crime. So you've got groups out there doing everything, and we're trying to work with those groups, increase their capacity, and increase the support for the work they're doing, because the work they're doing is not just good neighborhood, not just that, it's good for the entire region. Because if we have a region have urban cores and suburbs now, by the way, that are experiencing these problems, we're going to be in trouble as a region. Those costs are imposed on everybody. We're not going to be a prosperous region without healthy and stable neighborhoods.
I know that when you and I talked on the phone, we had talked about getting in, and that's a much larger conversation than the 30 seconds that we have left here. So I'd like to have you come back at some time, perhaps early next year, and we can continue this conversation, because that and building communities or rebuilding communities is a very, very important topic that we need to be talking about, because these are people's lives we're talking about here.
I would welcome the opportunity to talk some more. It's been very enjoyable, Lee.
Thank you very much for being with us today. I appreciate your being here, especially on such short notice as well. And to my audience, I've been speaking with Todd Swanstrom. He's a professor at UMSL. You've heard the conversation, hopefully, you've heard all of this by now, about the foreclosure crisis in the United States. It's not over, it's still ongoing. There's still another 4 or 5 million houses out there, and St. Louis County has a plan for mediation. You might want to look into it yourself. Thank you very much. See you next time.